The Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned Kenji Kanasugi, a minister at the Japanese embassy in Seoul. It was to lodge a complaint over Abe's dispatch of a government representative on February 22nd to an event declaring its sovereignty over Dokdo Island. Since taking office, the Abe administration has dispatched high-level government officials to the annual event that celebrates its territorial claims to Dokdo, aggravating Korea-Japan tensions. According to the announcement made by the Korean Foreign Ministry spokesman, the Korean government strongly condemns this action, saying that Dokdo is part of Korea historically, geographically, and legally. The statement refers to the Japanese government's claim to Dokdo as historically regressive behavior. The public also protested against the Abe administration's distortion of history textbooks, which state that Korea has illegally occupied Dokdo, which belongs to Japan.
독도를 사랑하는 대한민국 국민과 단체는 강력히 규탄한다.
Japanese wartime sexual slavery is another historical fact distorted by the Japanese government. The Japanese government has even tried to revise foreign history textbooks, in addition to distorting its domestic textbooks about Japanese wartime sexual slavery. Such provocations by the Abe administration has stirred the international community. The Korean government has maintained a strong stance against the Abe administration's distortion of history. On March 1st, an array of events were held to celebrate the Independence Movement Day and honor those who battled against Japanese colonial rule. And during this ceremony, President Bok urged the Japanese government to admit to its past atrocities with a sincere attitude.
역사란 편한 대로 취사 선택해 필요한 것만 기억하는 것이 아니라 역사에 대한 인정은 진보를 향한 유일한 길이라는 최근 한 역사학자의 지적을 깊이 유념할 필요가 있습니다. 일본 정부의 교과서 왜곡 시도가 계속되고 있는 것도 이웃 관계에 상처를 주는 일입니다.
Historical disputes have been rising in intensity since Abe took office. On today's Upfront, we discuss these controversies as well as possible solutions.
Hello and welcome to Upfront. Great to have you joining us today. I am Kang Tae-ri. The Japanese government's continuous efforts to revise its wartime history have stoked strong condemnations from the international community, including South Korea, China, as well as the U.S. On today's Upfront, we go upfront on the rationale behind the Shinzo Abe administration's continued efforts to distort history and their implications for the regional diplomacy. And joining us for this conversation, first up, Mr. Kim Soung-chul, Senior Fellow at Sejong Institute. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And of course, Mr. Bong Young-shik, the Senior Research Fellow at Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Welcome to our studio again.
Very pleased to be here.
Now let's get started with the recent news flow. So a group of U.S. historians have recently announced a joint statement protesting the Abe administration's efforts to attempt to revise U.S. textbooks regarding Japanese wartime sexual enslavement. What would be some of the takeaways from this story? They view this as censorship, is it?
I think Japanese government and the embassies in foreign countries, they try to monitor what other professors, scholars have been doing on research or publication, and sometimes presentation. So I think if the foreign scholars have different opinions from the Japanese government position, probably they try to influence and probably pressuring some change from their research or publication. And I think it's kind of absurd and kind of anachronistic. And I mean, as the professor's statement said, it's kind of infringement of the freedom of research and publication, academic freedom. So I think it's not proper.
What do you think this says about the Abe administration and how it's being received in the U.S. now?
We all know Prime Minister Abe is serving now his second term as a Prime Minister, not the first term.
Right.
And based upon the fact that we initially expected that Prime Minister Abe would be far more cautious in advancing his own ideological and political agendas to bring rouge on the Japanese imperial past, because he has suffered a great deal of setback when he highlighted his ideological agenda in so much denial of Japan's past wrongdoings in his first term since 2006.
Right.
So we thought that although Abe, as a political leader, might have not changed his values and beliefs in history, but he could have been and would have become far more pragmatic in dealing with these very sensitive issues with the rest of the world, including South Korea, China, and the United States. But judging from the fact that Japan's government has mobilized a great deal of resources and manpower, including its own diplomats, inside the United States, not just toward the South Korea and China, Japan's former colonies. That means that Prime Minister Abe and his cohort are far more determined to highlight their political and historical agendas than we initially expected.
But it doesn't really seem to be working so well, at least in Washington these days. I mean, regarding this case alone, the State Department has come out with a statement supporting this joint statement by a group of historians. Pretty rare for the U.S. government, I would say, and you can correct me on that later if I'm wrong. Is Washington getting frustrated with the Shinzo Abe administration's approach?
You can say that. It is clear that the Obama administration has been quite frustrated by some of the actions taken by Prime Minister Abe himself and his government in recent past. One example is the immediate response issued by the U.S. Embassy in Japan when Prime Minister Abe, to the surprise of everybody, went ahead to visit Yasukuni Shrine on December 26th of 2013. The Ambassador Kennedy issued a statement that the United States is disappointed, which is a very bold, clear, and strong statement. Considering the fact that Prime Minister Abe threw a great deal of welcoming party to the new U.S. ambassador to Japan at the same time. And that's a part of the reason why President Obama changed his itinerary of his state visit to Asian countries to include South Korea as one of the destinations. But at the same time, the U.S. frustration on these controversial behaviors by Abe administration does not constitute the whole picture of U.S.-Japan relations. United States still needs Japan in order to complete its security agenda, dubbed as a rebalancing strategy toward the Asia-Pacific. You cannot deny how important Japan is as the ally to the United States for its Asia-Pacific security agenda. So frustration, yes, but at the same time, the United States still sees a great deal of benefits by forging good partnership with Japan.
Now, let's meet one of the 19 historians, the group of historians who've issued this joint statement that we were talking about. Professor Sheldon Garin joins us from Princeton University. Professor, thank you so much for making time for us today. First, tell us, what was it? Which part of its history stated in this textbook published by McGraw-Hill that the Japanese government wanted to revise?
Prime Minister Abe was angry about the way that the McGraw-Hill textbook portrayed the comfort women. Certain parts he thought were inaccurate, and so I think he targeted those. But in general, he clearly is trying to deny Japanese state responsibility for the comfort women issue and to silence critics.
Now, with the relations between Seoul and Tokyo at a new low over historical as well as territorial issues at this point, what's your outlook on the bilateral relations down the road if the Japanese government were to continue on this path of nationalist strategy?
Well, right now it doesn't look very good. It's very surprising to us. I think we're very surprised how Prime Minister Abe, since he's been in office, has managed to worsen relations with the Republic of Korea. It seems odd. Both countries have conservative leaders. They agree on many things. Both are democracies. Both have free media. So Japan and the Republic of Korea should have very good relations. It's quite amazing that Prime Minister Abe and his foreign minister have managed to so worsen relations.
All right, so not looking so good there. All right, Professor, got to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and insights, Professor Garin there from Princeton University. Now, we are going to talk to one more member of this group of historians for another view, Mark Selden, a senior research associate at the Cornell University's East Asia program. Thank you so much, Mr. Selden. Welcome to the show. Now, my first question is, I asked this question to the panel in the studio as well, but how do you think the Abe administration's efforts to sway views of Japan's wartime history will go down in Washington?
And Abe administration has had its consular people walk into the office of the professor who was responsible for that textbook, Professor Ziegler at University of Hawaii, and tell him he should eliminate all reference to the comfort women and eliminate the passages there. Of course, he refused, and a conversation followed, but the textbook publisher, which is McGraw-Hill, one of the biggest publishers of textbooks in the U.S., of course, backed up the historian, and there is no change. But this is illustrative of the kind of frenetic quality of the Abe administration at this point, which is particularly interesting since he's about to come to the United States to speak to the U.S. Congress, something that no Japanese leader has done for half a century. And my hope, although I don't know that it's the case, my hope is that some of the outstanding issues around historical memory will be taken up not only between Japan and Korea, but between the United States and Korea.
Now, the Japanese government is certainly fighting views abroad concerning the country's wartime actions. How should the international community respond?
We're just at the moment of the 70th anniversary of World War II. So this is a particularly critical moment because each of these countries are going to be reflecting on and implementing policies that reflect on their stance, on their recollection of that war and the meaning of the war. Are we going to have from Japan what we are seeing so far with the Abe administration, which is a insistence on that war as a just war, on rejecting the apologies that the Japanese government has made on several occasions. And my hope is that there will be increasing communications among the peoples of the countries I've just mentioned through conferences, through communications, through the media, and that the Japanese government will recognize that this is not the time for turning back to the policies of the Asia-Pacific War, the policies that led to such disasters for the people of Asia, including the people of Japan, and that it's time to get on with building new cooperative relations, which will have to depend on common understandings of this past.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Selden there from Cornell University. So, you know, I mean, we've heard some strong words there. I think I heard fanatic qualities of the Shinzo Abe administration. At this point, are we worried that this could actually, such strategy could actually isolate Japan from the international community further?
I think Japan has now territorial disputes with other countries like Korea, China, and Russia. And now they try to kind of hide the wrongdoings of past history and distort historical textbooks. So if Abe government continue behave like this, then probably, including territorial disputes, probably the relationship, Japanese relationship with neighboring countries and United States may be aggravated, and the possibility of gradually being isolated in the global community. I think 21st century is a kind of the period of globalization and information sharing. So comfort women issue or the Nanjing incident or territorial issues, territorial dispute issues, all the informations are shared by the global community. And already many issues were recognized by the global community as historical facts. Historical facts is truth. So if Japan wants to change those historical facts, probably international community will not accept that kind of behavior.
Can this negatively affect Japan's standing as a decent member of the international community with the size of the economy that it's got going on and the diplomatic power in this region? What do you think?
Well, it is one thing to say that the impact of such behavior would prevent Japan from doing more as a big contributor to international peace, cooperation, and development. It is another to say that such incidents would definitely bring Japan's status down as one of the leading countries in the world. I think the chance will be more likely to be on the first possibility that many of the very ambitious agendas laid by Prime Minister Abe to realize that Japan is really back. Japan as a bigger, greater contributor to international justice and peace can take some setbacks. But at the same time, there's also some countervailing, phenomena that would facilitate Japan to play a larger role in international peace and cooperation, such as the very unfortunate incidents of the killing of 2 Japanese hostages by ISIS in the Middle East. That triggered the very sympathetic international sentiment for Japan to be allowed to enlarge the role of its self-defense forces to participate in international missions against the international terrorist groups. So on one hand, Abe's controversial actions would undermine the international status of Japan. On the other hand, there are some other changes in international politics that facilitate Japan to exert more influence on international matters. We have to keep the balanced view to assess how Japan's future status as an international player will be set.
All right. Now, at this point, let's take a look at this next report on how the Abe administration's historical perspectives and its domestic as well as global PR campaigns, shall I say, are being received within the Japanese society.
What does the Japanese public think of its government's distortion of history? According to a recent survey, 8 out of 10 Japanese citizens think that the Japanese government has already made enough compensation. Does the young generation in Japan share the same perception on the issue? According to a survey targeted at Japanese college students, 37.6% thought that enough compensation has already been offered by the Japanese government. Along with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's landslide victory in parliamentary elections, the Japanese government has stepped up its push to revise history. The number of textbooks in Japan adopting the right-wing stance has rapidly risen in comparison to a decade ago, and it is expected to grow with the extended term of the Abe administration. The Japanese government also approved a textbook saying that Korea is illegally occupying Dokdo Island. It has also increasingly distorted history education by eliminating Japanese wartime sexual slavery in history textbooks. Strengthening history education and establishing historical consciousness is becoming increasingly necessary for Korea amid rising tensions between Seoul and Tokyo.
All right, so back in 2014, the Japanese government approved 4 types of textbooks that are claiming sovereignty over Japan's sovereignty over Dokdo Islands, and that state that Korea is illegally occupying these islands. Now, this spring, sometime very soon, we are looking at Japan's another plan to review textbooks. What do you think we're going to get?
The reason why the Japanese government has been consistently portraying the Dokdo Islands as Japan's sovereign territory is not only because Japan is interested in claiming its sovereign rights over the territory, but also it is related to Japan's policy toward other island disputes with China and Russia. In order to strengthen its claim and bargaining positions toward Russia over the sovereignty of the what so-called the northern territories, the 4 Kuril Islands occupied by the Soviet troops toward the end of the Pacific War. And in order to strengthen its claim over the Senkaku Islands, Daiyotai in Chinese, the disputed islands between China and Japan, it is necessary for the Japanese government to have concerted effort and consistent bargaining positions to cover all 3 island cases with China, Russia, and South Korea. So although it seems like Japan's main interest lies in taking back the Kuril Islands from Russia, but in order to facilitate its effort to realize that goal, it was deemed necessary for Japan's government to highlight and emphasize the Japanese position with regard to other 2 island disputes with China and South Korea.
So it's not exactly in a position where it can drop one particular claim with one particular country.
If you even slightly change your bargaining position and strategy in one island case, then you would have a direct impact on Japan's bargaining position in other 2 cases, which Japan's government find unacceptable.
All right. And, you know, Dr. Kim, you were saying that, you know, the Shinzo Abe administration seems pretty set on the idea of having to instill his historical views on the young minds in the country. But there are voices that are opposing this strategy as well within Japan, although it may not be majority. Is that correct?
Yes, I think there are opposing opinions, voices within Japan, but I think they are not majorities, they are minority groups. And although they raise voice, but probably they will not change Abe government's policies on these issues. And many Japanese people just stay calm, quiet, so they may be quiet, kind of tacit consent. They give consent to the Abe government.
Yeah, I'm also inclined to agreeing with what Dr. Kim just said, because absence of powerful opposition in domestic politics and the very weakened position of intellectuals with more liberal perspective on historical and territorial issues enable the Abe administration to continue its very ambitious claims over these issues. So prior to witnessing coming back of the progressive in the power in context of domestic politics in Japan, then it'll be too early for us to say that the Japanese government is ready to see those things in a more straight manners.
But let me specify my question and ask maybe Dr. Kim about the Japan-U.S. relations. It's been hiking up its PR campaign that I keep calling it that, especially overseas, especially to the U.S. audience. What does it want out of Washington when it comes to its territorial views and historical views? It sort of looks like it wants to hide behind Washington's back.
I think Prime Minister Abe emphasized his historical mission this term, for his second term, is constitutional amendment. He said the constitutional amendment is his mission for this term of his prime ministership. Means U.S.-Japan alliance is very important, and U.S. wants to maintain and strengthen U.S.-Japan alliance. So Abe is confident of U.S. support for the Japanese kind of recovery, economic recovery, or kind of military build-up, or constitutional amendment. And when he wants to have constitutional amendment, he wants to have some kind of consolidation of domestic factors and people, and consolidation and kind of mobilization of Japanese people. And there are many the contents of constitutional amendment. When he talked about this time the constitutional amendment, they talking about the third reformation of Japanese the state, normalization of the Japanese state. And the first constitution was after Meiji Restoration, Meiji Constitution. The second was during American occupation after the end of World War II, and peace constitution. But they want to have a new constitution, new form of state in Japan. So that's probably similar to after Meiji Restoration. So the status of emperor may be raised, and Japan may have a normal military. So when kind of Japanese political leaders and Abe, Prime Minister Abe, talking about constitutional amendment is kind of the big form of national reformation, restoration, reformation. So they, I mean, including the people's education and nationalism, and also historical factors, national pride, the glory of Japan's empire, a revival of that, economic recovery, and military build-up, and everything included. And so I think Japan, I mean, the Prime Minister wants to continue that and try to have a majority vote in constitutional amendment.
How worried should we be with this kind of policy out of Japan? I mean, like you were saying, that he wants to instill this idea that Japan should be sort of free from post-war shackles. We're back militarily, economically. I want to groom the young minds in Japan so that they have the similar historical views as mine. Should we be worried in the longer term?
Well, as I said at the onset of this program, that the bottom line is that it is a matter that should be determined by the Japanese people themselves. And this is a matter that other countries, such as US, China, and South Korea, can only play an indirect role in reminding Japanese people of what they may lose if they begin to walk in that direction, following the leadership's point. It is very unfortunate. I personally think that the Abe administration has not done enough to highlight and educate the Japanese people about the positive role played by the peace constitution established during the American occupation.
Now, considering that this year, 2015, marks the 70th anniversary of Korea's liberalization as well as the end of the Second World War, some are saying that this may be to cover up its disgraceful defeat in the war and sort of avoid responsibility for compensation. Do we agree with this take?
It is very important to understand how the Japanese psychology would take a particular view on the end of the Pacific War. The Japanese people, especially the generation who had a personal experience and memory of the Pacific War, by and large believed that the war was a wrong war. They were duped by the imperialistic fanatics. But at the same time, many of them still seems to believe that although it started as a wrong war, there is no denying that Japan fought the war against the Western imperialist powers on behalf of and in defense of other Asian countries and their people. But it is very different perspectives that Chinese and South Korean people have in redressing the legacy of Japan's imperialism and the Pacific War. Because from the standpoint of South Korea and China, it was never asked that Japan would become their patron.
Defense.
Right. And the life under the Western imperialism would have almost the same, as bad as the colonial period experienced under the Japanese occupation. So there's nothing to be thankful for what Japanese have done during those period of era of imperialism. But some Japanese people still have a very different idea about the legacy of the Pacific War. So which makes it very difficult for the people on both sides to narrow the perceptive gap in understanding the history.
Certainly a big gap there. Now, let's find out more about how much of a gap there is. Let's now hear from some Korean students on the Japanese government's inability to face its history. Have a listen.
Upfront went out to the streets to hear opinions from Korean students about the Japanese government's distortion of history.
I think it is natural for Korean citizens to be infuriated by the Japanese government's distortion of history.
I hope Japan admits to its past atrocities with a sincere attitude, just like Germany did.
Japanese students accept what they have learned from school as true, which are actually untrue. And I think that is the biggest problem.
Compulsory recruitment of the Japanese wartime sexual slavery is a well-known fact here in Korea, and the victims are still carrying out protests. So it is not right for Japan to revise history textbooks without taking responsibility for its past wrongdoings.
94.4% of Korean university students said the Japanese government should offer an official apology and compensation. How are middle and high school students in Korea being educated about the distortion of history?
I learned more about the Japanese government's distortion of history from TV or newspapers than at school.
I don't think we learned about the Japanese government's attempt to distort history in schools. I've never learned about Abe's attempt to distort history at school, although I've seen it on the news or on the internet.
There's a reason why students haven't had the chance to learn about the Abe administration's distortion of history. The proportion of history in the Korean education curriculum is only 5.3%. The proportion is 3 to 4 times higher in Germany or France, and twice as high in Japan and China. Now is the time to better educate the younger generation about the Japanese government's distortion of history so that they may show leadership in future historical disputes.
So we listened to what Korean students, young minds here in Korea had to say about the Japanese government's approach here. What are some of the implications for the South Korean government?
What Korean government should think is we should utilize international community, international society. So whether Japanese kind of trial of historical textbooks issues or the territorial issues, whether it's kind of violation of international norms or international common rules. We have to appeal to the international society and community whether Japanese behavior is correct, proper, and we have to respond to the appropriately, and we have to follow the international, the community's response, and we'll step aside with U.S., Europe, or China.
Okay, so work. Sort of bring the international community into this conversation so that we can get Japan to maybe apologize or whatever the South Korean government would like. What would be acting accordingly and properly with the Tokyo government at this point for South Korea?
We have to keep the balanced view on what has been going on in terms of the history education taking place inside Japan. I agree with Professor Kim that there is a very concerning trends going on inside Japan, especially among young Japanese people. Taking side on the very hard line and anachronistic historical understanding. And many of the young South Koreans are also, possessing very negative attitude towards Japan, especially its leadership. So that explains why the current state of the bilateral partnership is one of the lowest point in recent history.
If I said Japan, I meant to say the Japanese government, the Shinzo Abe administration. Now, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about education, but not necessarily Japan's education or the Japanese government's education policy in Japan, but I want to bring that the keyword into South Korea. So against this backdrop, you would think that South Korean government is trying its best to educate its own young minds about the correct version of its history, but not necessarily in reality. Some say that we're not doing enough of that. And I hear that students, as they move higher up in their grades, they're getting less history education. Do we need to be concerned? How serious will this turn out to be down the road?
I think it's a very important issue. I mean, history is very important to understand national identity and international relations. And China and Japan seriously emphasizing the education of history, the history. So I think we should teach, we should know and teach more of Korean history and the relationship with China and Japan and United States. So it's very important, and we have to emphasize these historical issues.
I'm in an agreement that more provision of appropriate and correct educational materials for young generation of South Korean history is welcoming. But at the same time, we have to caution ourselves whether, we may be preoccupied with compelling our young students to hold on to specific version of history without giving them enough space and time to explore all the important materials available out there.
So there is an effort, although we can do more. That's according to some people here. Now, Korea's education ministry says it's supplying education materials, books in about Korea's easternmost islets, Korea's sovereignty over easternmost islands of Dokdo to overseas education institutes and government offices, as well as schools of all levels around the country. Our team went out to meet with Mr. Seok Dong-hyun, a Secretary General of the Northeast Asian History Foundation that helped to develop these books. Take a look.
We've tried to communicate with academics and civil organizations in Japan, as well as in Korea and other countries, to promote the correct perception of history. In 2011, we distributed 1.2 million textbooks to elementary, middle, and high schools across the nation, and we revised them a little last year. This time, we added more pictures and English text to be used overseas. We also published an additional version for teachers. When the new semester begins, we will supply the textbooks to primary and secondary schools nationwide. When the new semester begins, we will supply the textbooks to primary and secondary schools nationwide so that the younger generation can have an accurate perspective on historical issues, including Dokdo.
Now, let's move on and talk about what the South Korean government can do down the road. And I mean, North Korea and South Korea, they're together in on this, right? So, I mean, it did look like, North Korea did look like it was cozying up with Japan a little bit earlier last year, but not much of a momentum there, right? I mean, as long as I can detect. Could this provide an opportunity for the two Koreas to work together in putting the Japanese government in check somehow?
I think so. I mean, if we can find the areas of cooperation with North Korea, probably North Korea is also emphasizing the history issues and territorial issues. So, if North Korea and South Korea take the similar stance and kind of diplomatic appeal to Japan against Japan, then I think we can work good. I think
one more member against Japan, I guess. So now, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the normalization of the Korea-Japan diplomatic ties. Trying in search of a way to somehow break this deadlock in the bilateral relations, what would be the attitude? What would be the approach that you would like to advise for the Seoul government? Dr. Kim?
As I said, the Korea and Japan had a long history of interactions, exchange. Right. We have many areas of cooperation, conflicts, and discussion and negotiation. So we can kind of divide the issues and respond to the different issues differently, properly, according to the issues. Something like territorial issues. We recently found many documents, materials from Japan. Japanese government and Japanese people recognized Dokdo was Korean Joseon territory before 1905. So we can make kind of video or pamphlet, advertisement that with those documents, our materials, we make similar videos, and we can distribute to YouTube or international community. So like historical textbooks or territorial issues, conformity issues, many things we can have materials, and we can have advertisements and pamphlets, and we can distribute to international society. We make a direct diplomatic appeal to Japanese government or the United States or United Nations or European countries. Also, we have cooperation, kind of economic cooperation that's continuing, so we can continue that. But one thing is trust building of the countries. Sometimes we had trust between two countries, so we didn't have much serious problems. Sometimes we have very serious conflicts, and these days we have some serious conflicts. So the leadership communication, if the two countries' leadership has relative communication and trust building, then probably many conflicts, provocative actions between two countries will disappear or will be ameliorated. So I think in any international relations, the dialogue or communication is very important.
So keep the dialogue going, keep the cooperation that we can get to keep going, but make our appeal through the international community. Dr. Bong, your word of wisdom today.
Well, I'm in agreement with what Dr. Kim said, which highlight the importance of leadership. Park Geun-hye administration is now entering the third year of a five-year presidency. And the Park Geun-hye administration has embarked upon a couple of very important multilateral foreign policy initiatives, such as NAPSI, Northeast Asia Peace and Cooperation Initiative, and trust-building process in Northeast Asia, and MICTA, Middle Power Initiative, as well. But these initiatives, unfortunately, have not borne visible fruits yet. One of the main problems involved in this initiative is that the South Korean government has not really actively courting Japan to participate in those initiatives. But in order for South Korea to exercise regional leadership, especially in the context of Northeast Asia security and cooperation, South Korea cannot afford to just talk to all the relevant countries in the region except for Japan. Japan is a very important country for South Korea for many reasons, for its national security, economic development, cultural exchange as well. So it is up to Park Geun-hye administrations to have an objective assessment of the past record of its foreign policy toward Japan and other countries. And the Korea-Japan bilateral partnership is not just a matter between Korea and Japan. Other countries are watching how South Korea has been dealing with Japan and calibrate their policy towards South Korea in accordance of their assessment of the Korea's foreign policy towards Japan. So pragmatism should be the key word for Park Geun-hye administration if it hopes to wisely and effectively spend the remaining 3 years of its presidency toward Japan. Somebody said that South Korea and Japan need to be behaving like very pragmatic, business-oriented lawyers in the courtroom. Those lawyers do not need to like each other.
Sure.
It is understandable that they may be hostile toward each other, but they have their own respective interests to be served. So although we suffer from very negative conditions of the bilateral relations between the countries, that does not necessarily mean that both countries cannot do any work to enhance their own respective national interest. Emotions is one thing, and pragmatic interest is another.
All right, so with your words of wisdom today, let's see if the next 3 years can provide a momentum to improve bilateral relations. Thank you, both of you, for coming in today and sharing your thoughts with us.
You're welcome.
Very much.
Thank you. And thank you, our viewers, for watching. That will do it for this edition of Upfront. I'll see you next time.